Thank you all for joining. Again, my name is Charles Hornig from the League of Women Voters. I'm the technical Zoom coordinator for this first Friday forum on what does it mean that Lexington is an MBTA community. A few housekeeping matters. This webinar is possibly being streamed live and is certainly being recorded for later viewing on Lex Media and other platforms. We'll be using the Zoom chat feature for any Zoom technical issues you have, and I will try to respond to them as best I can. We will be using the Zoom Q&A feature later for questions from the panelists after they've given their initial presentation. We will not be using the raise hand function, and we won't be taking questions directly verbally from participants. If you are having trouble with sound, do check your computer volume. And if that doesn't work, it is possible to connect to this webinar by telephone. The instructions to do that are in the same place that you found the link for the meeting. Finally, I'd like to introduce Melinda Walker of the League of Women Voters. Melinda is going to be moderating the panel session here. Just a moment. Melinda, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm the membership chair of the League of Women Voters of Lexington. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning to the fifth of a series of First Friday forums hosted by the League of Women Voters to promote awareness and understanding of public policy issues. On January 14th, 2021, some of the most sweeping zoning reforms in 40 years in Massachusetts were signed into law as part of House Bill H 5250, an act enabling partnerships for growth. These major zoning reforms will affect every municipality in the Commonwealth. And this morning, we're very happy to welcome 4 panelists who will help us understand how the reforms will affect our community. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to take a short moment to read a quote from a press release from CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, about House Bill H 5250. Quote, "A shortage of affordable homes, decades of restrictive zoning, and a history of gentrification and redlining continue to perpetuate segregation in our state. The housing provisions in the Economic Development Bill are much needed tools for systemic change towards more equitable housing policy. With these tools, communities will be able to create more homes for people who need them while preventing displacement and promoting fair housing for all." Now I'd like to introduce our panelists for this morning's presentation. First, we will hear from Chris Clutchman. Chris is the Deputy Director of the Community Services Division of the Department of Housing and Community Development for the Commonwealth. Chris oversees and coordinates several community service functions, including land use, housing production, economic development, and technical assistance at DHCD. She manages several programs, including the Housing Choice Initiative, grants for rural communities, and in support of local planning. A former Lexington resident, Chris and her family now live in Acton. Chris is going to provide an overview to the changes to Chapter 40A. And next we will hear from Eric Shupin from CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. Eric is the Director of Public Policy of CHAPA, and he has been the director since 2016. He is responsible for directing CHAPA's affordable housing advocacy agenda and policy team, which includes CHAPA's policy committees, the Policy Leadership Council, and CHAPA's federal advocacy through the New England Housing Network. Prior to joining CHAPA, Eric was a student attorney at legal clinics in Washington, D.C., where he represented clients in housing court. He's worked with many housing and community development nonprofit organizations while serving for 2 years in the AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps. He has a BA and a JD from the George Washington University, and Eric is also a member of the Massachusetts Bar. Eric is going to discuss why housing production is so important for Massachusetts. Then next we will hear from our own planning director, Amanda Loomis. Amanda has a BS from the University of Southern Maine in environmental science and policy with a concentration in applied ecology and site plan review, along with a master's in community planning and development with a focus on land use and the environment from the Muzzy School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. Over the years, Ms. Loomis has undertaken many zoning and subdivision rewrites and updates that allow for increased housing options, including exclusionary zoning, cluster developments, multifamily, and townhouse styles of housing. Prior to joining us in Lexington, Ms. Loomis was the planning board administrator for Framingham for over 9 years. Amanda will discuss how these reforms will affect Lexington. And then during the Q&A portion of our event, we'll be joined by Elizabeth Valenta. For the past 3 years, Elizabeth has served as a housing specialist with the Regional Housing Services Office. Prior to joining the Regional Housing Services Office, she was the housing program manager for the City of Newton, managing the 13 community West Metro Home Consortium. She will be able to answer questions from attendees that are related to affordable housing in Lexington. And now I'm going to turn over the panel to Chris.
Melinda, thank you so very much. And League of Women Voters, it's a pleasure to be with you. I wish we could be here in person, and I look forward to the time when that goes on. Let's just go to the next slide. So as Charles and Melinda said, I'm going to give you an overview of the changes to Chapter 40A from the Housing Choice legislation and briefly touch on the Mbta Communities. So this is quite technical. The slides will be available through the League of Women Voters, should you like to get a copy of them. So the changes, the overall goal of the governor's legislation, which is called the Act to Promote Housing Choices, that was included in the Economic Development Bond Bill. The goal was to make it easier for communities to do zoning amendments that would produce housing. The changes apply to all cities and towns in Massachusetts, except the city of Boston, which actually has its own zoning enabling act. The changes changed what is Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act in Massachusetts. There is no opt-in for these changes. It just simply changed the law to make these available to communities. There is no requirement that communities make zoning changes, but it does provide that certain zoning changes will no longer require the supermajority, but instead would require a simple majority. And it outlines and specifically identifies good practices that would require the simple majority. And I'm going to talk about those in detail. Next slide. So I'm just going to jump right in. I've mentioned that there are certain kinds of zoning amendments that would qualify at town meeting in Lexington for a simple majority instead of that 2/3 majority. And I know people at the League of Women Voters understand that it can be quite difficult to reach that supermajority. So zoning that would allow multifamily and mixed use in eligible locations as of right, if there was a zoning amendment to provide for that, that would qualify for a simple majority. Certain accessory dwelling units, if there's a zoning amendment to allow ADUs, as we call them in planning jargon, accessory dwelling units by right and attached to existing primary dwellings, that would qualify for a simple majority. If Lexington wanted to pass an open space and residential development provision that allowed for those subdivisions to happen as of right, that would qualify for a simple majority. As of right means that there's no discretionary permit required. So it means you could apply for, that there would be a simple, clear and objective standards for that provision. Also, zoning amendments that allow for housing by special permit, such as multifamily and mixed use in an eligible location, would also qualify for simple majority. Accessory dwelling units that are not attached to the primary home, if Lexington were to, again, come forward with a zoning amendment to allow that, that would qualify. If you have an amendment that allows in your zoning bylaws to increase density on property by special permit, that zoning amendment would qualify for simple majority. And if you're reducing parking requirements for residential or mixed use development, those amendments qualify for simple majority. Sorry, my dog is deciding that she wants to participate in this panel. Let's go to the next slide. Again, qualifying amendments also include increases in density that allow for additional housing, such as allowing additional height, reducing setbacks, reducing parking, reducing open space requirements. If Lexington wants to pursue something under Chapter 40R, which are called smart growth districts or starter home districts, those would qualify for a simple amendment, for a simple majority. And likewise, natural resource protection zoning and transfer of development rights also qualify. Next slide. So there are also special permit. There are a couple places in the law that changed what happens at the board level, which is called a special permit granting authority, often a planning board, where the board votes are reduced to, instead of a supermajority, just a simple majority of the board vote would approve these projects. So when there's a special permit pending in front of, let's say, the planning board that would reduce parking spaces, that allows for more housing units, that could be just a simple majority of the planning board, for example. Or if Lexington, I don't know if this applies in Lexington, but if Lexington allowed for multifamily or mixed use in areas of concentrated development or near transit, and a project comes in with at least 10% of the units being affordable, then that special permit decision by the planning board would just need a simple majority. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk about how that second, the last thing that I just talked about, how that might work. So this only applies if a town has this provision already. And so let's just say that there's a town that allows for multifamily projects by special permit in its town center district, which happen to have a commuter rail station. And the special permit board is the planning board, and it's a 5-member board. So in that case, if a developer submits a project located close to the transit facility for a 100-unit building and it has 12 affordable units, instead of needing 4 out of 5 votes to approve the project, the planning board could approve that project with 3 out of 5 votes. Next slide. The new Chapter 40A also includes a provision that wants to be clear that you cannot take advantage of a simple majority if you have a zoning bylaw amendment proposed that includes other provisions that would not qualify for simple majority. So any amendment that requires simple majority vote shall not be combined with an amendment that requires a 2/3 majority vote. Next slide. There's also a provision, which I won't spend a lot of time on here because it doesn't apply in Lexington, but there is for city councils and town councils. So there are towns like Watertown that have a town council system of government. There was a provision in Chapter 40A prior to the legislation that allows for a protest vote when the city councils, for example, passes a zoning amendment and people don't like it. There was a provision for 20% of the landowners and abutters to be able to raise a protest, and it raised the vote to 3/4 majority of that city council or town council in order to affirm the amendment. As changed, it makes it more difficult to protest a vote, requiring 50% of the abutters or affected landowners to protest, and then that vote would be affirmed by a 2/3 supermajority. Again, this does not apply to Lexington because Lexington has a town meeting form of government. Next slide. So we've talked about now that this bill and the legislation changed, added this two different kinds of voting threshold. We have the old kind, the supermajority, that would still continue to apply to many types of zoning amendments, but it doesn't say who is going to determine when a proposed zoning ordinance or bylaw can be approved by simple majority vote. And so my agency, Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development are charged by the legislature to develop guidance. And in fact, we have issued some guidance related to this. And I'll give a web link later in the presentation. But what we have in this guidance, we are making some recommendations, and we're recommending that proponents, such as someone who puts in a zoning petition, be clear when they initiate a zoning amendment, whether they think it should may be approved by the simple majority vote. And then we also recommend that the planning board, after it consults with its municipal legal counsel, that in its report on zoning amendments, which as most of you probably know, is required that the planning board give a report prior to town meeting taking action, and that in this report that the planning board's determination about the voting threshold be made clear to the legislative body or town meeting. And then that way the legislative body's vote will be consistent with that recommendation. As you may also know, all bylaws and zoning amendments passed by town meeting must be submitted to the Attorney General's office, the municipal law unit, for review to see if it's consistent with state law. And while this is a new, these changes are all new, we don't have any precedents yet, it is the Attorney General's office, this municipal law office, that will start setting some precedent as they start approving or reviewing bylaws that are being proposed for change. Next slide. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Mbta Communities portion of the law. This was added by the legislature and inserts a new section 3A into chapter 40A, and says that if you are an Mbta community, you must have at least one zoning district that allows for multifamily by right up to 15 units, at least 15 units per acre, cannot have age restrictions, and it must be suitable for families with children. Again, as I mentioned, this is another section where the legislature has required us to consult with the MBTA and to provide guidelines. There is a penalty if communities do not comply with this, is that the communities would not be eligible for certain state capital grants, such as MassWorks and the Housing Choice Capital Grant Program. And we pretty much immediately issued some guidance that clarified that until guidelines are set, every community is in compliance. And if we could go to the next slide. So we do understand that this new provision is something that needs a robust stakeholder process, and we look forward to working with communities to get feedback and take comments in implementing this, to make sure that communities have adequate time to respond to this, and that we adequately define what compliance means. And that, but again, at this time, for the current round of grants, all communities are deemed eligible, and we'll have more information about the stakeholder process in the next weeks and months. Next slide. So here are some of the resources that I mentioned. If you want to find the actual guidance that has been issued, it can be found at mass.gov/housing-choice. And that is a place where you can continue to look for information and guidance about the stakeholder process related to MBTA communities. There are other helpful documents there, such as a redline of the Zoning Act with the new provisions. If you have a question or a comment, you can send it to housing-choice@mass.gov. We may not be able to respond to every individual question or comment, but I do want to note that all of the questions and comments, including the ones that will come forward here, will be helpful for us as we continue to develop the guidance. And I think from there, I'm going to pass it off to Eric.
Thank you, Chris. And so I'm Eric Shupin again. I'm the Director of Public Policy at CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. And we're a statewide advocacy organization that works to increase access to affordable housing here in Massachusetts. And so what I'm going to talk about today is why is this important? What does this mean for Massachusetts and addressing some of our housing challenges? And so I'm going to start by going through some of those challenges that we face when it comes to housing and access to safe, healthy, and affordable homes for everyone. I'll start by saying that, of course, there's no more personal of an issue than housing. Everybody is impacted by it. And that has become so much more evident in the times of COVID, when our home has now become our home office, our schools for our children, where we recover from and recuperate from illness, and where we protect ourselves when we have to socially distance or isolate or quarantine from the virus. And so in that context, it's just that much more important that we work on providing safe, affordable homes for everyone here in the Commonwealth. And we know that we do have a housing shortage, and what does that mean? And so that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about when we talk about housing, what does it mean that we have that housing that's available for everyone? What do we have available now? Who can afford that housing? Where is that housing being built? And what does that mean for equitable communities here in Massachusetts? And I appreciate the reading of the quote from CHAPA's statement at the top of this meeting, because it really comes down to that. We're talking about making systemic changes of how we build and create housing here in Massachusetts to create more equitable communities. So when we talk about the availability of housing, the question is, how much do we need and how much are we building? In Massachusetts, we are not doing a very good job right now of building new housing. Right now, we're building less than half the amount of housing that we built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what that means is that there's a supply and demand problem. During the last decade, Massachusetts added over 300,000 residents and over 400,000 new jobs. And so that's a sign of growth and economic growth, and that's a good thing. But over that same time period, we only permitted about 100,000 new homes. And what that means is that there's an imbalance that's created. What do we need? The estimates show that we have a housing supply gap of nearly 440,000 homes just to meet the current demand. That doesn't account for economic growth or coming demographic shifts with the aging baby boomers and young households wanting to move in here. And so what all of that means is that there's a strain in our market. And because of that, we see housing prices going up and up and up. Even in the time of COVID, housing prices in many places have continued to rise. And this gets to that affordability question. Who can afford to live in communities? And in Massachusetts, we have the third highest home values in the United States, behind only California and Hawaii. For rents, we have the 8th highest rents in the country. And that puts a strain on families and across all income levels, across all age groups and demographics, but particularly for those households who are most vulnerable, our lowest income households. In Massachusetts, there are over 300,000 extremely low income households. That means that people are earning less than 30% of the area median income. Those are poverty level households. And of those households, 250,000 of them pay over half of their income towards rent or towards housing costs. And what that means is that they're just one missed paycheck, one emergency financial crisis, an unexpected medical bill, particularly in the times of COVID, away from not knowing whether they're going to be able to make their rent or their housing payment, and leaving them at risk of homelessness. And we see the impact of that in Massachusetts when it comes to people who are experiencing homelessness. On any given day in Massachusetts, there are 18,000 people experiencing homelessness, including over 12,000 people and families with children, over 6,000 individuals, and 1,000 veterans. And so our lack of affordable housing contributes to those rates of homelessness. And so in order to begin addressing those, we need to create more housing opportunities. The question of where are we building, location is something that is also very important. Are we taking advantage of our public transportation system using existing infrastructure to build housing around? And the answer is we're not doing a very good job of doing that either. Our housing is not very well aligned with transit, especially around the commuter rail. And overall, we have very low densities around public transportation nodes. And this increases reliance on cars, contributes to traffic and congestion, and to pollution. It contributes to our climate change crisis as well. Which then gets to the fourth point I want to talk about is equity. Do people have meaningful opportunities to live in communities of their choice? And all of the things that I've talked about when it comes to our housing shortage, the housing affordability challenges that we face, all lead to people not having that meaningful choice, of people being excluded from communities or displaced from the communities that they've lived in. So housing production rates are low, but it's also concentrated in just a handful of municipalities. Boston, in recent years, has accounted for over a third of our housing production in the state, in the entire Commonwealth. And what that means is that while there's concentrated development in Boston, other surrounding communities aren't creating the housing that we know there's a demand for. And what that means is that people are either facing displacement or they're unable to move into that community. And this, of course, impacts our most vulnerable households, our lowest income households, and often includes communities of color, and prevents them from having meaningful housing choice of where they want to live or their ability to stay in their community that they've lived in for years now. When we talk about equity and housing choice, it's also about what kind of housing that we're building. What are those housing opportunities look like? And in most cases, the housing that we create are single family homes. In Massachusetts, that's the easiest thing to create. But we know there needs to be a range of housing options for all incomes and for all demographics. If we're building only single family homes, those are often the most expensive kind of housing that we can build. And they don't provide the opportunities for young working families to maybe break into that community, to break into the home ownership market, to move from renting to owning their home, which is that key opportunity to build wealth. And it's also preventing older households from downsizing from their homes that they lived in and maybe want to move from their single family home to a more modestly sized condo or a smaller home. And there aren't those housing opportunities either. And so when we talk about providing those housing opportunities, we need to think about where they are, but also what kind of housing we're building. So that brings us to what are the barriers that we face in providing meaningful housing opportunities, meaningful housing choice. And of course, zoning and land use is such a big piece of that, a big piece of the challenges that we face. Local control over housing, something that we're proud of in Massachusetts, local home rule, is important, but in providing these opportunities to create housing, we need to have that zoning in place at the local level to permit housing to be built. And in Massachusetts, for a very long time, we've placed a often insurmountable barrier when it comes to the legislation that Chris was just discussing, housing choice. That lowers that threshold from a 2/3 majority to a simple majority to pass certain pro-zoning, pro-smart growth zoning, pro-housing zoning bylaws or special permits for multifamily housing. And that's what we see as empowering communities to choose what they want to build, and making it easier for communities who do want to do something like passing a special permit to allow affordable housing around public transportation, creating an accessory dwelling unit bylaw to do so, and to begin to undo years of exclusionary zoning that has been put in place over the past century. Certainly something that has been getting attention is something called redlining, where there's a history of discriminatory zoning that was put into place, and that's still in place today. And it was intentional about being created, and we need to be intentional about undoing those discriminatory zoning practices that have created segregated communities. And this provides us the opportunity to do that. Zoning decides what gets built and where, and who gets to live in a community, and many times who doesn't get to live in your community. And so by enacting some of these zoning reforms, including housing choice and the MBTA community provision, we can begin to undo some of those discriminatory land use practices and start permitting and allowing the kind of housing and the amount of housing we know we need in Massachusetts. So that's a very high level overview of, from the Commonwealth perspective. And now I know we're going to talk more about what this might mean for Lexington. And so with that, I will turn it over to Amanda.
All right. So what does this actually mean for Lexington? Zoning reform is something that's been worked on for many, many years and finally being passed. It's had very many acronyms such as SLRPA and SLEPA and everything else. But this is a major breakthrough. And this provides a lot of opportunity, as the previous speaker said, to allow for equity and inclusion and kind of remove those barriers for maybe kids that grew up in Lexington but can't afford to stay in Lexington, or families wanting to move to Lexington, or older populations that have grown up in Lexington, moved away, but actually want to come back for that kind of community that they've missed because they had to grow up or move to a different area. But really moving the barriers to allow for creative housing types, such as townhouses or clustered housing options, smaller houses that allow for more community and neighborhood establishment. So what we're going to be looking at is just some things that Lexington faces as terms of challenges, but also what can and can't be done to move us forward. So there's a lot of great things happening in Lexington right now. We are currently working on Lexington Next, also known as a comprehensive plan update. That is something that's been in the works for about 3 years, but we are actually making sure that that gets done by the end of the fall of this year, which is 2021. There's been a lot of outreach done previously, and now we're getting ready to go back out to the community to see what really the community wants, what is needed, and what has changed. A lot of things have changed over the past 2 and even the past year with COVID, the bringing to light the need for equity, but also what we want to do is make sure that we are creating a community that Lexington and the residents of Lexington and the community wants to see. Also, right now we're looking at Hartwell, which is a Hartwell Innovation Park, as a rezoning effort. That first part is really looking at commercial options, but in the fall, we're actually going to be looking at housing, including housing either within the Hartwell Innovation Park district or around it, kind of trying to figure out what the best option is. Other projects that we're currently working on is a special permit residential development. That is the looking at existing bylaws and seeing where they need to be updated or needed to be improved to allow for housing diversity. That kind of brings in that whole open space residential development option that's going to be allowed by right. And there's a lot of other planning efforts that is going on in Lexington. Next slide, please. So just a real quick, this graph on this slide here shows how the housing sizes have actually kind of decreased since 1980 and it's kind of leveled off, but the population is continuing to increase in Lexington. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this slide here is showing the population in Lexington per square mile by block group. So Lexington is broken down into a series of blocks groups. As you can see, near the municipal line of Waltham and Lexington, that is where our most dense housing is. And then up on the northwest corner where Bedford and Burlington kind of intersect, that's another area, also near Woburn and Winchester. But as you can see, that area right in the center, which is like that light pink color, is the central business area or the Battle Green. So that is an area that we don't have a lot of housing. Lexington is 16.43 square miles with approximately 2,000 people per square mile as of 2018, which is actually up from 2010, which was about 1,900 people per square mile. The housing stock that we have here in Lexington, about 36.7% was constructed between 1950 and 1969, with about 21% constructed before 1939. So what does that mean for Lexington? That means that there is opportunity for creative housing options, such as additions to historic homes, creation of townhouses or infill development because of the large lots. But also we need to be mindful that because we have a more spread out community, a lot of people have to drive, which increases traffic congestion. That's something that we are mindful of as well. About 54.9% of Lexington households have 2 or more vehicles. Next slide, please. So this slide here is just showing the average square feet for a new single family home has increased while the household size has actually decreased. So what does that mean? It means that we basically need to provide options for all different types of households. So what we know is that 36.1% of Lexington homes have 9 or more bedrooms or rooms, I apologize. But 31.8% have 4 bedrooms or more, with 78% of Lexington homes having 3 or more bedrooms. Only 6.5% have a 1 bedroom. So that means that these homes are very large, but we might not need those. As we can see in a few slides, is that Lexington's population is aging. Since 2009, Lexington has added 35 accessory dwelling units to their existing housing stock. But when I previously said median housing or median ages of our population, since 1980, the median age was 36.8. It increased to 43.7 in 2000, and it's now up to 45 as of 2017. It is expected that in 2022, that it would be up by 48.7% or 48. Next slide, please. And so this slide here is just kind of showing these age concentrations, what we're looking at. So we have about 28% of our population is between 0 and 19, but then the other percent, 34% of our population is between 40 and 59. So this is kind of an indicator that there may be more families within Lexington moving here for either being close to Boston, schools, or other moving back after they've gone to college or other endeavors. Next slide, please. So just looking at Lexington as a whole. So this is Lexington. The areas that are shown in red are our commercial districts. Areas shown in gray are commercial planned development districts. Planned development districts they allow for different alternatives to the zoning through pretty much a mutual agreement with the town. They do require town meeting action. Next slide, please. So we know that transit-oriented development, or being a MBTA community, is very important with this new legislation. So we do not have a commuter rail stop, nor do we have a T stop, but what we do have is bus lines. And so these orange dots indicate all of the bus stops on the MBTA. As you can see in the very center of Lexington, which is shown in red, that's the downtown area. The areas shown in purple, those are our manufacturing or commercial districts that are, concentrated over by the Bedford and Waltham line. The areas that are in white, those are planned commercial development districts. So next slide, please. For that compliance with multifamily housing within a half mile of a MBTA stop, this is what we are looking at now. So these orange rings indicate a half mile from each one of those bus stops. So as you can see, a lot of our commercial areas are actually within a half mile of the bus stops, which is very important for creating housing opportunity. Next slide, please. But Lexington is an actually very connected community, because not only do we have this road system, we have a Route 2, we have a 126, but we also have this great connections through trails. We have the Minuteman bike path, but we also have all these other avenues that we can get to our locations or destinations that are not by the single occupant vehicle. So this is kind of important when we're looking at where can we add this multifamily housing district, or where can we put these open space cluster developments, or where can we create new kind of housing developments that allow people to move from one location to another location in Lexington. Next slide, please. So just looking at some examples, so 15 units per acre, that seems like a lot of units, but we actually do have quite a few here in Lexington already that were established. Next slide, please. So Lexington Place, this is right downtown. We have at 50 Waltham Street. It was constructed in 2009, and it did require a planned development district. But these are 30 ownership units. They are 15 units per acre. They are on an MBTA bus route, and they are comprised of either 1 to 3 bedrooms. So it's hitting those targets that were identified in the new reform. So in the slide on the upper right-hand corner, that just kind of shows what's happening on Waltham Street. So you're looking at 3 stories, but 1 story is the retail, and then the upper 2 stories are the residential, which hits that mixed use kind of component, which is what we are looking for. As you can see in the aerial, there is off-street parking for all of these units, so they can actually park themselves. They have commercial on the first floor, and they have residential. And when you're in the downtown area, you're actually seeing that these aren't much different than what could be there. If you were under existing zoning, you're limited to 25 or 30 feet with an FAR or floor area ratio of 2. Next slide, please. Another great project that Lexington has is the Muzzy High School condos. This is a conversion of an old school, no longer used as a school, located at 1475 Massachusetts Ave. Converted in 1985, this has 71 units that are rental. 12 of those are affordable. And I should mention that there are 3 affordable units in the Lex Place, which was the previous example. This sits on a 3.85 acre site, and it actually has about 18.4 units per acre, and it's on an MBTA bus route. Next slide, please. So this is another one that we have is Arlington or Avalon at Lexington Hills. This is also located at 1000 Main Campus Drive. It has 387 rental units. 97 of those are affordable. It's a 22 acre site. It was a former institutional site converted over through the residential district. This is an RD-10 if anyone's interested. But it has 17.5 units per acre. It's not on an MBTA bus route, but Lexington has all these other great options for public transportation, the Rev and Lexpress. So next slide, please. So what does this really mean for Lexington? Lexington has a lot of opportunity. Our close proximity to Boston, we have a large population that can commute in and out of the city, but we also have a lot of jobs here in Lexington. But what we need to do is actually review the pending regulations that we're still waiting for from the state level. That is going to be key in terms of where we move from here. So we don't want to start planning without knowing what is coming down the pipeline for those. However, during our comprehensive plan process and other planning efforts, we can start to identify districts that we could locate these multifamily projects in by right, or these mixed use projects. There is a lot of great opportunity for this because we are going to be having community conversations about specific neighborhoods, commercial corridors, and commercial nodes within Lexington. Also, we would want to review our bylaw for potential amendments. This should really be done every 5 to 10 years, but zoning is one of those items that it's key to how a community looks and feels, but it's actually very difficult to get zoning to move forward because zoning is kind of that thing that no one really knows how it works. So it takes a while to kind of understand what is going on and what needs to happen. But that's also why we need to update our comprehensive plan, because that is where we get our direction to make amendments to our zoning bylaw, our subdivision rules and regulations, our general bylaws, and establishing other policy and regulations to help guide Lexington. We also want to engage the Lexington community. So that means our stakeholders, whether it be our landowners, our businesses, our residents, our companies, etc. It's very important that Lexington hears the voices of all of our stakeholders, because that is how we get to know things more. There's a lot of things that are getting done at the government level. However, the residents, the businesses, etc., are out in the community every single day, and they're seeing things a little bit differently than the decision makers do. So that is something that we want to make sure that we are engaging the community. Also, mapping. Mapping is key. It's something that we need to look at constantly to see where things are going, where new development is occurring, and where there's opportunity to have infill development or other types of development. But again, we would need to make sure that we have landowner and stakeholder discussions to make sure that, one, they're engaged, but two, to make sure that we're actually planning properly. So I believe that we are going to now move into Q&A. And so we will go from there.
Yes, and if you'll give me just a moment to set things up here. We will be taking questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. And so feel free to use that function to type your question. I'll be reading the questions to the panelists and they will be answering. And our first question to whoever feels moved is, what about families that make less than $40,000, which I think are about, we're talking 40% of AMI here. What are we doing, or should we do, or can we do here to address their needs?
I can start off. This is Amanda. So this is an extremely important item that we need to look more at. Not just the 40,000, but also workforce housing. There's a large gap between our affordability and what is actually in the market here in Lexington. Median household or median price is about $800,000 to $900,000 and up. So that really kind of separates that gap, where other communities might have a smaller gap between affordability, which is that 80% area median income or AMI, and the next tier. Lexington has a very large gap. And so that is something that we have to look at. But the great news is through these different types of reform, we can actually have a requirement that 10% affordable. I believe that was a requirement of the bill. But we can look at it more holistically and think maybe it's not just 10%, maybe it's 15% like other communities do increase it to, but looking at it across the scale. But the multifamily allows for different types of housing income ranges to actually live in one place, but also be introduced into Lexington more. I don't know if anyone else or Liz has anything to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Excuse me. I think you're right. I think it's really difficult to plan for housing for that lower income tier. Rental housing is often available through the Housing Authority or through LexHab in Lexington specifically. Other community organizations help provide housing for those lower income households.
If I can add, along with the economic development legislation that we're talking about that had these critical zoning reforms also included tens of millions of dollars to support affordable housing. And it's the marrying of those two ideas that we think really provides an outstanding opportunity to plan for and create affordable housing. I talked about, what are the housing challenges that we face? Zoning is a key barrier for creating, deeply affordable housing for lower income households. The barriers are resources. And so the legislation doubled our state low-income housing tax credit. And the low-income housing tax credit is a financing resource to create affordable housing. It's something that, supports the developments that have those income restricted or set aside units for certain income levels. So that's going to mean $20 million more a year for that program in Massachusetts. And it also created resources for supporting affordable housing around public transportation, which is exactly the kind of housing when we talk about what needs to be around an MBTA stop or another public transportation node. There's resources for supporting affordable housing developments in those kinds of districts. And so it allows both the legislation allows the community to zone for, and then the resources hopefully to support the affordable housing. Now, of course, that's a question of getting that development proposed and shaping it to meet the needs of your community. And that's where all of you can be really active about talking about, well, we want that kind of housing that can serve those income levels of $40,000 or less. And that's really a critical piece of having all of you be involved in those conversations in your community.
Okay, our next question noted that many of the eligible locations that were identified in Ms. Loomis's slide correspond to our historic districts in Lexington. How does that fit in? What can you say about how the need for housing here interacts with our historic districts?
Yeah, that is extremely important, especially given Lexington's deep history. So if it was going to go into the downtown area, that would be making sure that there's additional review. Obviously, the various historic districts would have to review those as well. But it's really kind of looking at everything all the way around. So this would be a conversation that the community needs to have as a whole, whether with like the select board, the planning board, the historic districts, the housing authorities, etc., just to make sure that everybody is in the conversation. If this is something that Lexington is going to look at, putting a multifamily district in the central business area or any area within Lexington. So it can't just be, a decision based on a map. It really has to be a conversation with all individuals in Lexington, because this is the future of the community, not just today.
Okay, next question is developments that are taking advantage of the new majority vote thing. Are they required to have a certain percentage of affordable units? And I'll expand the question a little bit to, are they forbidden from having a requirement? Can we require affordable units in them?
I'll take a crack at that. There are no requirements for what is called inclusionary zoning, or where you require a certain percentage of affordable units. For example, in a bylaw, I would note there's definitely not a prohibition. The reform measures are meant to promote all sorts of housing, and certainly not to preclude affordable housing or requirements for affordable housing. So, but there is inclusionary zoning is not required to meet the mixed use or multifamily housing.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. The next is a more general question, perhaps, is how do you handle neighborhood resistance to new developments that allow us to meet these housing needs?
I can do that one. So you know what? It's again communication. Lexington is not. If you're going to put multifamily districts in areas, you need to look at the context of where you're going to be putting it in. We should not expect to put 6-story buildings, 7-story buildings, 8-story buildings in an area that is, let's say, no increases in topography, and that you have residents all the way around, because that's just going to basically create a concentration, and that's all they're going to see. But if it was at the same level or the same scale, maybe a little taller, but not really, you can actually get some really good projects. A single family home in Lexington can be built up to 40 feet in height. And so when you look at it, 40 feet, because we in New England like our pitched roofs, which is great because of snow and everything else, but when you have like different types of development, you can use more of a flat roof, which you don't have to go as tall, but you can also hide the mechanical equipment and everything. Also, architects, it's really important that the community work to establish how they want these things to look and feel. And that's also the previous question with the historic district. There can be a conversation prior to this even being, released or decisions being made about how the projects are going to look and feel and what the expectations are, so that a developer doesn't come in with a new modern building that's, aluminum siding, large windows, but rather something like Lex Place that kind of just fits in like it's always been there with those dormers and the brick facades. Downtown Natick did a great job because they have a consistent look in their downtown. So they have had new buildings go in, but those new buildings actually look like everything else is in it. They look like they've always been there. So that's the key, is making things look the way that the community wants to, because a homeowner, I think of myself when I'm doing all of these things, is like, if I live and they're putting in a new multifamily across the street, I'm going to be the one having to look at it all the time. But what do I actually want to see there? And that's why it's important to engage the community at the very start of this whole thing and throughout the entire process, because it helps shape the project, but also improve the project.
I like Amanda's example of Lex Place. I remember when that came through at town meeting, and I believe it took at least 2 town meetings to be passed. And I think that's exactly the kind of mixed use development in a location that is served by transit and has other commercial development that might have qualified for a simple majority had this legislation been in place back in 2008 or whenever it was coming through. So I think that's a great example of a project with 15 units an acre. So, keep that kind of project in mind when you're thinking about this new requirement.
Okay, our next question, I think, is for Ms. Loomis. Are any of the articles in the 2021 annual town meeting warrant addressing this effort?
You know what? No, there is not in this annual town meeting of 2021. We're looking at Hartwell's Article 45. We also have Article 44, which is townwide amendments. And it's not. Those are really looking at, one, a commercial area and making sure that Lexington is getting the projects that it wants. And also townwide efforts that really are good practices that were identified in Hartwell, but should be for the town, such as electric vehicle charging stations, and increase in maneuverability with bicycles and pedestrian accessibility, also decreasing impervious pavement. But with that being said, the next part of Hartwell is really looking at, can housing be introduced into Hartwell or around Hartwell? We do know we have some great sites that are right around Hartwell, and that is something that we need to look at. Whether, we put multifamily or mixed use projects, just like Lex Place, somewhere that's along the bike path, so people can get on the bike path and bike to Hartwell. They can get down to Hayden, they can get down to these other areas, but also they can get right into Somerville and Cambridge. So that's what we need to look at the community as a whole. And that's why the mapping really does help us look at places. The comprehensive plan is allowing us to look at places a little bit more in depth, but also get that community conversation started and then moving forward from there. So the long answer short, no articles for annual town meeting of 2021, but we will be starting to look at that for a future town meeting.
Thank you. Next question is about the MBTA. The MBTA does serve Lexington, but the service is not great, and it has been, in fact, declining. What can we do to get the MBTA to enhance its service to allow this new housing to actually use it?
So I can't really comment. I'm not commenting officially for the administration or the MBTA. So please don't take this as an official comment. But I do think that is the, like I mentioned before, the comments and questions at this event and other events that are taking place as we present this new legislation are going to be helpful to develop guidance as we go forward with the MBTA communities. And I think bus service and the frequency of bus service is a comment that I take to heart and that I will take back and share with others.
Thank you. I'm trying to scatter the topics of the questions around here. We have a lot of questions, so I very much appreciate our attendees for giving me a lot of choices here. If a homeowner who lives in an eligible location is interested in exploring moving forward with some sort of mixed use development, how would they start that conversation? Maybe that's for Ms. Loomis.
Yeah, so, it's a lot of times where we have a lot of projects that the initiation of a project actually starts with just contacting the planning office. And what we do is kind of talk with the landowner or the applicant or the developer, and kind of figure out what they're doing, try to give them guidance as to what can and can't be done. But also, in previous roles that I had, the best thing is when we had test projects, when we were developing concepts for zoning and we had potential projects coming in, to use that potential project as what could and couldn't be done, because oftentimes when you're putting zoning together, you're running scenarios to see what should and shouldn't happen. But when you have a real life example where someone's actually paying for the engineering to be done, it helps us try to understand what can and can't be done and move things around. So it is, initiation is starting with the planning office and then moving forward from there. And then one thing I do want to touch on real quick, and it should have been in my presentation, is when they're saying multifamily, there's a lot of different types of multifamily. Townhouses could be something of that. And when they say open space cluster, it's, putting a lot of great townhouses together in alternative types of housing, but leaving the rest of the area open for open space, which Lexington does pride itself on, is having a lot of open space and trail connections. So.
Okay, I'm going to group a couple questions from people here. People are interested in using smart growth overlay districts, both as a means of producing mixed use and multifamily housing, and as under 40S as a way of perhaps mitigating some of the costs to the town for educational services. Could any of you talk a bit about the opportunities and downside of using 40R and 40S?
Well, I can talk a little bit about Chapter 40R, the smart growth or starter homes districts that are provided for in legislation. So right off the bat, those are qualifying for a simple majority, so they should be easier to pass through town meeting. And again, in looking at housing production, we feel like this is a major step forward. The law does provide for zoning incentive payments to the town if a 40R district is approved. So when after the zoning is passed, there's a payment to the town that's calculated based on what the prior density would have been and what the new density is, because it is generally an up zone, or it is generally adding density to a particular site or district. There is an approval process through my agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and it generally does require some back and forth between, let's say, Amanda's office and your legal counsel to make sure that everything, that the district meets the requirements. But because there is payments associated with it, we pay careful attention to it, and it does need an approval. And then if a project gets built, there are further payments. So those are payments that come with the district. The 40S provisions are if Lexington can demonstrate that there is an impact to increase school costs, that there is some payments available for that. I will say that in the many years since this legislation has passed, there have been very few 40S payments, because generally adding new housing does not actually change the cost of the schools. So that is a little bit of a myth that people have, and the 40S really brings it home, because communities who have adopted 40R have not shown that they have increased school costs. The other thing I want to say about schools in general, and Amanda touched on this about the presentation about demographics in Lexington, There are fewer and fewer school children. Just generally in demographics, school children, populations could be decreasing over time. So not adding new housing and not adding new children may actually be negative to Lexington School District because you may be losing school age population over the long term.
I just wanted to jump in and share a report that CHAPA had put out in 2018 on Chapter 40R, including the use of Chapter 40R in Massachusetts, looking back at how it was used, as well as suggestions on what we can do to strengthen it. One of those recommendations was make it easier to pass the districts, which is what Housing Choice does. So we're excited that Housing Choice is going to provide the opportunity to do more 40R districts, which again promote smart growth and affordable housing and community support. So I'm going to post in the chat box a link. Hopefully you all received it. I sent it to the panelists and attendees. And it provides a good overview of what Chapter 40R is, how it's been used, and hopefully some ideas for how to use it in the future.
Okay, thank you. The next question is there anything in the new legislation that the new buildings that this might trigger happening achieve some level of resiliency and sustainability?
The simple answer to that is no. There is no specific resiliency or climate vulnerability measures that's built into Chapter 40A from these changes. I will say that in general, by using the terms eligible location and by having the requirements for housing near transit, those are good for the climate. And so, smart growth development, putting higher density housing near transit is going to be overall good for the environment. But other than that, those are general provisions, and they're definitely baked into the bill. But there's not a specific requirement, for example, for net zero buildings or anything like that.
And I'll just jump in and again add that while there's no requirements, again, they're talking about the resources that this legislation also provided for. There is $10 million authorization for supporting climate resilient, affordable housing. So we're excited to see that was included, and hopefully will be used to support that kind of affordable and also sustainable housing.
Okay, another question. The bill in the MBTA side of the bill talks about a half mile from various things. And the question on everyone's mind is a bus stop count as a bus station?
Thank you for the question. I've had that question a couple times this week, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer. That is part of the policy discussions that will be going on through this robust stakeholder process. We value input from local communities on this. And so if you have strong feelings either way, those would be helpful. But that is one of the provisions we'll be looking at right away when we start the engagement about the Mbta Communities piece.
And another question is, one of the problems is we don't have enough appropriate housing in Lexington for current residents who need to downsize. Is there a way through this process to reserve the housing we build for current Lexington residents?
That is a very good question, and it's also a question that we struggle with every day. Is because we hear that I have a very large home. I no longer need, as I mentioned in my slides, this 5-bedroom house, but I don't want to leave the community, because there is this, you've grown up in a community, you've lived in a community, you've established your roots, and then actually having to pick up and move to a different community at a certain age, you have to start all over again sometimes. And so that is something that we do have to keep in mind. There is a local preference to affordability. However, with that local preference, it has two sides of the coin. It's good in some sense because you're prioritizing people who have established themselves in Lexington, but then you're also excluding people from either coming back to Lexington or actually introducing themselves to Lexington. So it's something that you need to look at. but in the regulations, there's no requirements for it. But with that being said, these cluster types of development, Pine Hills down in Plymouth is a great example. And there's other examples throughout the Commonwealth where they've actually created townhouse or small cottage-like developments, preserved a lot of open space, made it all about walking. And a lot of the times those are where you downsize, and then new families can move into those residential larger units if they wanted to.
Okay, another question is, will builders really be willing to build smaller units because they can make more money building big units rather than building small ones?
You know what, I think it's dependent upon, this is Amanda, sorry, where you are. Because a lot of other communities actually have a lot smaller units. 2,400 square feet might be the normal there. So developers do build based on what the market is. But with that being said, if we're allowing for smaller units, but more units, that would be something that the market would shift to. The other thing it's important is just because it says for families and you add a 3-bedroom, it doesn't mean you're going to get 20 kids in that 3-bedroom house. The one thing that we have seen a lot of, as Chris mentioned, is this size of the houses or children are decreasing. But you might have a couple, one child, and they're actually using, especially in this COVID, using that 3rd bedroom as an office. So that is a lot of what we're seeing is people using these bedrooms actually as office space or guest rooms where they're not actually occupying them all.
Okay, one that I'm pretty sure we won't get an answer to is any chance of getting the state to finish the red line and get it out to 128.
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that question. I think we need to go back in time to the time when the state, my understanding of history of the red line is that some communities did not want it. So I think it's more not in what's going to happen in the future, but what happened in the past. But I really can't comment on that.
Yeah. No, more from comic relief than anything else, I'm afraid, for those who were here in 1975.
But the great news is that we do have the Minuteman bike path, and that's used a lot. So that's a great resource that we do have, even though it is not a red line, but it does move a lot of people on a daily basis. So.
And more seriously, do you have some examples of municipalities that have been successfully adding to their affordable housing inventories, and what lessons can we learn from them?
Oh, there's a lot. Like my previous community, Framingham, they added a lot of affordable units because they had a 10% requirement. The town of Brookline also has, I believe theirs is at 12% affordability. So they are creating. The biggest issue where a community has an inclusionary housing bylaw, formerly known as an affordable housing bylaw, is those hit the units that are special permit. So if you are getting subdivisions cannot require affordability because subdivision is the creation of a roadway and the division of the land. Then you're incrementally adding only subdivisions. That puts that challenge on that affordability piece, but also as more and more single families go in, those also don't have the affordability piece. But Framingham's a good one, Natick is a good one. And then I think Liz can actually comment on other communities that she works with.
Yeah, sure. I was going to mention Bedford. They're over their 10%, and they currently have a LIP project coming through town. So that's a local supported project. Since they are over their 10% requirement. Acton also is active in increasing affordable housing through LIP proposals. Concord as well has some additional units, both through the Housing Authority and through their special permit process. So those are some communities that have added affordable units beyond sort of the 10% requirement through local initiatives.
Elizabeth, could you explain what a LIP is for people who don't know?
Sure, it's a program through the state that allows developers to develop a project that for communities that are over 10% that don't have state support, state financial support. So it goes through the town first before going to DHCD for their site approval.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been trying to prioritize questions that are related to the topic of the session.
Could I mention something, Charles?
Certainly, Ms. Walker.
One of the provisions in this legislation is that it creates a process for residents of local housing authorities to be appointed to the boards of their local housing authorities. So currently the Housing Authority Board the Board of Commissioners is made up of 4 elected commissioners and 1 appointee from the governor's office. And I wanted to mention something related to this, that I think this is a really wonderful idea because one thing is that people who do not own homes in municipalities don't really have much power on the municipal level. Very, very, very few people who are elected to town meeting actually live in rental units or are tenants. Most of I haven't done deep research about this, but I don't know if there are any members of any elected or appointed boards in Lexington that are tenants. And I think that it's really important when we talk about increasing affordable housing, that the people who need or want affordable housing have some say in how this housing is developed. Because when we talk about stakeholders in Lexington, we're talking about landowners. And I'm really, really happy that even though this is a small step, I'm really happy that in this governor's bill, that there is going to have to be a tenant on every housing authority board to give tenants a greater voice in what happens to them in their communities. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate that little aspect of this bill that people probably haven't been paying a lot of attention to. Thank you.
And Melinda, Charles, if I might just tag onto that, there's a Boston University professor named Catherine Einstein, who with her colleagues has done some studying of very interesting research into who participates in housing discussions. In fact, they wrote a paper and then they wrote a book. It's called Neighborhood Defenders. And through that process, they analyze projects across Massachusetts and minutes of planning board minutes and who showed up to support housing projects, who showed up to oppose housing projects. And there are interesting conclusions that they drew. Generally, people oppose housing projects who show up at planning board meetings. They tend to be white male homeowners, and they are older than the typical median age of a community. So there is actually, Melinda, there's research on that, and there's been a book written about it, which includes recommendations about how to improve things. And their new research, I believe, is about elected officials and tenancy. And I think they've done research across the country that 95% of elected officials are homeowners. And so that you're absolutely correct. There is a very small percentage of people who are tenants. But if you are interested in that topic, look for Neighborhood Defenders by Catherine Einstein and her colleagues.
Chris, you were reading my mind. I posted the link to the article that then inspired the book. But the article is a great place to start because it really is a fascinating study of who participates, and then that drives what our communities look like, who makes those decisions. So great point.
Okay, just a few more. We'll have time for just a few more questions. Is this legislation in effect now?
Yes, it was in effect immediately upon the governor's signature on January 14th.
Okay, that was a quick one. That's good. Is it possible to use this legislation to divide an existing large house into 2 or 3 or 4 smaller units?
I think, oh, Christine, go.
I would, it's going to depend on the local zoning and if you need a zoning amendment to do that, because most of the bill applies to zoning amendments to allow certain things to happen. But in general, an amendment that would say that large houses, that would set the allowance of conversions of larger housing into smaller units would qualify. I'm going to say generally, I believe that would qualify. And Amanda, I'll turn it to you.
Actually, Charles, I may have misspoke earlier. Article 39, does that touch on housing relative to historic homes, or is that just the amendment?
Well, Article 39 amends our existing zoning bylaw section 6.2, which allows adaptive reuse of historic structures. I can't remember now whether converting a historic structure into multiple dwelling units was permitted. It certainly would be permitted if Article 39 passes.
So that is something from a previous question, just to add in there, that when they asked about an annual town meeting, so Article 39 might help a little bit, but yeah, we would need to look at our regulations our zoning bylaw to make amendments to a lot of this, because Lexington has, minimum lot size, 15,000 square feet. So there's a lot of things that would actually restrict you from being able to do this open space residential development, multifamily, mixed use type of development. But the great news is it's now on the table. The conversation has started. And so now we will continue that conversation throughout, and then also make sure it's really reviewed during our comprehensive planning process.
So as we run down in time now, we do have a lot more questions that we will not have time to get to, but I wanted to ask our panelists, first of all, if there are reference materials, pointers to your slides, or pointers to any other reference materials that you want to communicate to the people attending. If you could put them in the chat, sending them to all attendees as Mr. Shupin has been doing, that would be helpful. If any of you want to take a very short time, like a minute, to give a closing statement after this, I'd also think that would be appropriate. Anyone want to take me up on that?
Sure, I will. Again, thank you so much, Charles, Melinda, Margaret, and the League of Women Voters for inviting this panel. It's a juicy topic, and I'm very grateful to be here to talk about how we need more housing in Massachusetts and the tools that are now on the table to get that. I've put the link to where the formal guidance is posted on the mass.gov website, and I'll add the email address where you can post questions or comments. And then, Charles, I just asked, I'd be happy to take the full transcript of the questions, even those that we didn't answer, because like I said, it's very helpful for these questions as we are developing the formal guidance on both the threshold of vote matter and also the Mbta communities, because these questions will help us identify issues that guidance should address.
And I should add, if any of you have contact information that it would be appropriate to share publicly, you can also put that in the chat. I'm sure people may wish to approach you in other ways.
I wanted to just echo Chris's thanks. We appreciate being able to have this conversation, and that you're inviting us to participate and engage on these issues is really exciting. I'm going to post a link. There's a one-pager that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council put together on much of what we discussed here, an overview of the economic development bill and the zoning reforms in it, so that you can use that as a reference. And I'll just close by saying how this gets put into effect and how it really has an impact is engagement at the local level. So I encourage all of you to speak up for housing in Lexington and for the kind of housing that you want to see. What do you want your community to look like? It's your voice that is so important in shaping that conversation. So it's not just people who are opposed to housing saying, we don't want anything built here ever. It's the conversation that you can engage in on, well, what kind of housing do we want? What do we want our community to be and to represent? And so thank you again for having us this morning.
Okay, I'm finally going to introduce Margaret Copey to take us out. Margaret is the convener of the Lexington League of Women Voters. And just if you give me a moment here. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Charles, and thank you to all the panelists for this very informative and wonderful discussion today. I appreciate everyone taking the time. I also wanted to note that we had, at the height of the discussion, we had 60 people on the webinar, which and a lot of them were new town meeting members. So I was very pleased to see that. I want to remind everyone that the league all of our forums are free and are open to the public. And also that the league is a nonpartisan organization that never supports candidates, but does support policies and has done that for many, many years. Our next First Friday will be on the second Friday in April 9th. And we will be hearing from a discussion on clean heat, where we go from here. And we're hoping to get someone from Senator Barrett's office to talk about what's going on at the state level with his climate bill. So with that, I will turn it back to Charles.
And thank you all for your participation. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. As has been requested, those questions we didn't answer will be forwarded to the panelists for them to do with as they will. And we hope to see you in April.
Thank you, Charles. It was great.